Look, I'm going to be brutally honest with you. Normally, I would not be making this video right now because this video is going to be the third one in a month that's more or less on the same topic. And I generally don't do that. I find it boring for me, boring for you, the viewer. But I'm making this video anyway for three reasons. One, it's Christmas time. I still have holiday cards to send out to friends and family and patrons who signed up after the first batch went out. I have cookies to frost, I have presents to wrap, I have delightful little Christmas markets to visit. I don't feel like being picky about my video topics right now. Reason number two, I was just going to leave it in a comment on my previous video, but screw it. I already spent so much time on what I'm about to talk about that it gets to be a video. And number three, I'm really annoyed and I just want to vent, okay? So, after the election last month, I talked about my feelings and how I was currently in the middle of reading a book I found interesting and relevant, Why Civil Resistance Works by Chenoweth and Stephen. I talked a little bit about the research that went into that book, which I found in-depth and compelling. Many people in the comments on that video told me that that work was not, in fact, scholarly, that the research was cherry-picked and ridiculous, that it was used by naive pacifists to support tactics that don't actually work to create change. And I found that surprising because of how impressive I'd previously found this work, but it wasn't out of the question. I was still in the midst of reading it. And to be fair, I hadn't specifically searched for criticism of it, which I do usually try to do when citing research like this that's been around for more than a decade, long enough to be thoroughly studied and then criticized by peers. So with that in mind, I did just that. I specifically sought out and read criticisms of the work. After all, I love a good debunking of popular science. But interestingly, what I found mostly just made me more impressed with Chenoweth and their colleagues. In the years since that book was published, they've continued to update and refine their database of resistance movements. And in interviews, Chenoweth has gone to great lengths to highlight the constraints of their research, to caution against using this historical data to determine future actions, to stop people from taking things like the 3.5% rule as a law. That, of course, is the finding that a movement tends to succeed if at least 3.5% of the population actively joins it. But critics had pointed out some movements that Chenoweth and Stephen had missed that went against that rule. So they went out, they looked into it, they found that that was true. They found prominent examples that violated the 3.5% law, and they updated their findings to reflect that. That sort of missing data was the weightiest of the criticisms I found, and Chenoweth et al. Responded to them appropriately by acknowledging that their initial data set was incomplete and adding these new points to it, and then rerunning their analysis to see how things changed. That's science. That's how science works. A number of people in the comments on that first video also mentioned Peter Gelderloos' How Nonviolence Protects the State, written in 2007. A lot of you like it, but I'm sorry, I found it boring and completely devoid of actual evidence. It's basically an opinion piece, which it's understandable. That was written before most of this critical research on civil resistance was done. That's why I didn't mention it in my follow-up video last week, but a lot of you commented again recommending it. So I'm mentioning it now so you know that I don't find it compelling, but as always, links to everything I discuss are found in the transcript on Patreon and Skepchick. Feel free to go read it for yourself. People also recommended the book How to Blow Up a Pipeline by Andreas Malm, which I have not read in full yet, but I don't see much to disagree with from what I have read. He's a climate activist who argues that Chenoweth and Stephen's data comes from a wildly different political revolution and isn't applicable to climate activism, which I think that they would also agree with. After all, Chenoweth is on record stating that we shouldn't even use their data to predict what will happen in future revolutions that seem identical to the historical data. Mom also argues many revolutions are a mix of violent and nonviolent tactics, which Chenoweth and Stephen also freely admit. In many cases, it's impossible to tell whether a particular nonviolent campaign would have succeeded without a concurrent violent campaign. Sure, like I've said several times now, I have no moral quandary with violent resistance to authoritarian rule. None. And as I said, I don't think that Chenoweth's research precludes the use of violence against property, which Mom champions, and even against people. So, having read as much criticism as I could find of Chenoweth's research, and with current events making everything very relevant right now, I made my more in-depth video about it last week. By the way, I say Chenoweth's research as a shorthand. Chenoweth has worked with various authors on this topic. I don't mean to diminish their contributions to the field or to imply that Chenoweth is the only person working on this stuff, just that it's Chenoweth who seems to be doing the biggest, most interesting research to me. I have a lot of respect for the many other researchers who have pointed to gaps in their research, who replicated the findings, or who have contributed additional research in the field. So I felt pretty confident in sharing more of that research in the second video, as well as sharing what the authors have said it does and does not mean. Like, they aren't anti-violence necessarily. They acknowledge that this is messy historical data that they need to simplify in order to study, etc. But again, the comments were filled with people claiming that this research is bunk. For instance, user 5 Arrows said that Chenoweth and Stephen's data is cherry-picked and incomplete. It stumbles massively when confronted by serious historical analysis. Like, I'm sorry, but that work is just really easy to argue against in a wide range of ways. It's an opinion piece that many people have heavily disputed. When I asked for some citation to read from a critical expert, I was told that that was an odd appeal to authority and that Chenoweth and Stevens, are not experts in the history of India and post-war British occupation. They are not experts in the Vietnam War. I'll just pause here to note a particular irony. Asking for a peer-reviewed citation is not, in fact, an appeal to authority. That's just asking for quality evidence that would illuminate the issue. But dismissing research for the explicit reason that the authors are not experts is, in fact, an appeal to authority. You are literally saying, I do not accept this data because the person presenting it is not an authority. You're free to do that in your personal life. I do it. It saves me a lot of time, but it's not a logical argument. When I explained that and asked for specific details of what Chenoweth got wrong, 5 Arrows didn't reply, but another commenter, Panet Rosa, jumped in to say, 5 was very specific about what they are arguing Chenoweth et al. Are not experts in. And others in these comments have already pointed out that the problems with the research in those areas, such as categorizing the Vietnamese Revolution as nonviolent, which is obviously absurd. Aha! Finally, a specific point that I can investigate, and a point that makes a lot of sense. After all, how can we trust research on nonviolence when the researchers categorize things like the Vietnamese Revolution, of all things, as nonviolent? That is absurd. And again, I need to stress this point. I am not in any way personally invested in this research being correct. I love finding out that something I thought was right is actually wrong, because I get to learn something and then I get to share it with others. It's like my favorite thing. So I pulled out my edition of Why Civil Resistance Works, which conveniently happens to be a digital edition that allows me to do a search. And I immediately found this passage on page 99. When violent campaigns succeed, some key outliers. It is worth noting that there are some important deviations from our assumption that violent campaigns attract only limited numbers of participants. The Russian Revolution, Chinese Revolution, Algerian Revolution, Cuban Revolution, and Vietnamese Revolution come to mind as major examples of violent conflicts that did generate mass support sufficient to bring about revolutionary change. Seems pretty cut and dry to me. The authors are clearly stating that the Vietnamese Revolution was a violent conflict that worked. They don't even say mostly violent or violent in addition to nonviolent. They just say violent. So I replied with that and I waited. Pan had answered pretty quickly with the first reply, but a day passed with no response at all. But still, it bothered me, you guys, because there's no way that someone would just randomly assume these authors categorize the Vietnamese Revolution as nonviolent. I must be missing something. I have to be wrong about something here. This is why I fall down rabbit holes. This is why I am insufferable at parties. So I scrolled through other comments to find more information. I went back to a comment I had seen previously from Gunther Herman 6179, who said Chenoweth's study is cherry-picked, arbitrarily classified, and includes among nonviolent movements the Iranian Revolution and the Vietnam War. So I asked which page of the book that was on, and when I went back and checked, I realized he had responded. It's not in the book. Chenoweth's Novcode database is hosted at Harvard Dataverse. Holy shit, I had not even thought to check the raw data. As I mentioned, that data has been continually updated over the past 12 years since the publishing of Why Civil Resistance Works. So in that time, they must have changed their categorization of the Vietnamese Revolution. So I was off to Harvard's Nonviolent and Violent Campaign and Outcomes Data Project, which is in fact available in full to anyone who wants to have a peep, which, I love that. I downloaded the data, saw all the code names, immediately went back to check the legend because there are so many variables. Luckily, they spell it out for dummies like me. The column I was looking for was the binary prim method, which denotes the primary type of resistance method used in a campaign year. 0 equals primarily violent campaign and 1 equals primarily nonviolent campaign. So then I just had to set the column headers, sort by country, scroll down to Vietnam, delete a bunch of columns to make it easier to see. And there we have it. There are 10 campaigns, all of them marked with a 0. Which, again, means a primarily violent campaign. Well, Gunther also mentioned the Iranian Revolution, so I scrolled back up to that, and here's what I found. 9 campaigns, of which 6 were classified as violent and 3 as nonviolent, which sort of seems like, at best, a mixed bag that would not be relevant to the study, but yeah, okay, primarily violent, if anything. One of the nonviolent campaigns notes with a 2 under resists meth that this campaign changed from violent to nonviolent, and a 2 under violent flank, which indicates the campaign did have a violent flank, with an intensity of 3, which means they did use lethal violence. The scope of that violence was isolated, and it is unknown how the nonviolent participants responded to the violence. The document includes citations to the historians and political scientists who described this information if you would like to follow up and see the details about that campaign or any other. That does not sound to me like people who don't know what they're doing simply categorizing the Iranian Revolution as nonviolent. In fact, they don't do that at all. They simply found that a few out of 9 campaigns during that revolution utilized nonviolent tactics. At the end of the day, I have no idea where these commenters got the idea that Chenoweth and Stephen labeled violent campaigns as nonviolent when they quite clearly did not. I don't think these commenters are knowingly lying, but I do think there's a chance that someone knowingly lied to them and they accepted it without thought. The fact that one of them even tried to direct me to the very database that clearly proves them wrong is astounding. And I wonder if that's how they got fooled. Like some authority figure in their life said, oh yeah, that research categorized the Vietnamese Revolution as nonviolent. Don't believe me? Here, read this entire book or read this data. Go look at it. Go download it. Most people just won't bother. They'll just assume the authority figure telling them that must be telling them the truth. Why bother to do all of the work of downloading a spreadsheet and looking up some codes when you can just accept it? Maybe it already fits into your worldview. It's just easier. At the end of the day, this is hardly the worst misinformation spreading around, but it's clearly spreading around in my audience, and it's getting in the way of actual evidence-based discussions on how people in a variety of situations can find empowerment and enact change. There is evidence that violence works in certain situations, and it's time for people to admit that there is also evidence that civil resistance works in certain situations. And again, because I know there will be more comments saying stupid shit like, you can't ask politely for your freedom. Civil resistance is nasty. It is not nice. It is down and dirty. It is about fucking shit up and hurting the enemy in all ways except physical violence. That's it. So please stop spreading misinformation that will only push us further apart when we desperately need to come together. And especially stop doing it in my comment section. Now, if you'll excuse me, I'm off to put colorful sprinkles on gingerbread cookies for the revolution. Hey everybody, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. If you loved the video, please subscribe. And if you think the world could use more videos like this and you happen to have a few bucks laying around, head to patreon.com/Rebecca and join an awesome community of nerds like the people whose names you see on the screen right now. Thanks.